It all began with a gesture that everyone expected to be routine. The moment Will Smith spotted Keanu Reeves walking toward the stage, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. It was the kind of effortless greeting audiences had seen countless times before. The atmosphere inside Jimmy Kimmel Live was electric. Fans cheered as two of Hollywood's biggest stars prepared to share the same couch, and the room buzzed with anticipation. It looked like it would be another relaxed celebrity interview filled with laughs and memorable stories. But then something happened that no one expected. As Keanu reached the couch, he looked directly at Will's outstretched hand. Instead of accepting the handshake, he slowly lifted his own hand with an open palm. It wasn't an aggressive gesture or an emotional reaction. It was calm, deliberate, and unmistakably clear. Stop. The audience's laughter faded almost instantly. The energy that had filled the studio only seconds earlier vanished into complete silence. Even Jimmy Kimmel, who had been leaning forward with a welcoming grin, froze in place. Will's hand remained suspended in the air for a brief moment before he quietly lowered it back onto his lap. His smile never completely disappeared, but something behind his eyes changed. It was subtle, almost impossible to describe, yet everyone watching could sense it. Without saying another word, Keanu sat down. The silence inside the studio became overwhelming. Hundreds of people sat motionless, unsure whether what they had just witnessed was part of a joke or something far more serious. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer could be heard speaking urgently through a headset as the crew struggled to understand what was unfolding. The cameras continued rolling because stopping the broadcast wasn't an option. Then Keanu reached inside his jacket. From an inner pocket, he carefully removed a single folded sheet of paper. He placed it gently on the desk between himself and Will. He didn't slide it across the table. He didn't explain where it came from. He simply set it down as though it carried a burden too heavy for words. Will stared at the folded paper. Then he looked back at Keanu. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. "Before anything else happens tonight," he said in a calm, measured voice, "I need you to read this. Right here, in front of everyone watching." The room seemed to stop breathing. Will barely moved. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the studio microphones. Keanu held his gaze. "It came from someone who's been trying to reach you for 2 years, he replied. "Someone whose life you changed, and then never heard from again." Those words landed with extraordinary weight. But the story didn't truly begin on that stage. To understand why one of Hollywood's most private and respected actors would choose a live television broadcast for such an intensely personal moment, you would have to travel back years earlier to a city Keanu had never visited, and to a chapter of Will Smith's life that had remained hidden from the public. Few people had ever heard the story. If they had, they might have understood why a single folded letter could transform an ordinary celebrity interview into one of the most unforgettable television moments imaginable. The paper rested silently on the desk, yet it seemed to dominate the entire stage. Jimmy Kimmel glanced at it, then at both guests. Every instinct as a host told him to break the silence, crack a joke, or move the conversation forward. Yet something held him back. It was as if everyone in the room understood that this was no longer entertainment. Whatever was about to happen belonged to the two men sitting across from each other. Slowly, Will reached for the letter. He held it in both hands but didn't unfold it immediately. Instead, he looked at Keanu with the expression of someone weighing whether they were truly prepared to face whatever waited inside. "You could have called me," Will finally said. Keanu answered without hesitation, "She tried. For 2 years." Those few words seemed to strip away every trace of the polished performer the audience knew. What remained was simply a man sitting beneath bright studio lights, holding a piece of paper that suddenly felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. After taking a slow breath, Will unfolded the letter. No one in the audience dared make a sound. Every eye was fixed not on the page itself, but on Will's face. His eyes scanned the first lines carefully. At first, his expression remained controlled. Then, almost imperceptibly, it began to change. The confidence disappeared. His features softened. Something deeply personal surfaced behind his eyes. He reached the end of the page. Then, without saying a word, he lowered his gaze and read it all over again. When Will finally lifted his head from the letter, his eyes shimmered with emotion. The confidence that had filled his face earlier had faded, replaced by something deeply personal. The studio remained silent. No applause, no laughter, no whispered conversations, just hundreds of people watching a moment that felt too important to interrupt. But the letter, the refused handshake, and an easy silence hadn't begun on that television stage. Their story stretched back more than 3 decades. It began on a chilly October evening in Philadelphia, in a narrow alley that has long since disappeared beneath new buildings. At the time, Will Smith wasn't an international superstar. He wasn't a blockbuster actor, a Grammy-winning entertainer, or the household name millions recognize today. He was simply a determined 20-year-old chasing an impossible dream. The television deal that would eventually change his life had been signed, but the world hadn't seen him yet. Fame was still somewhere in the distance. To everyone around him, he was just another young man from West Philadelphia heading home after a late recording session. The streets were unusually quiet that night. Most storefronts were closed, their windows dark beneath the dull glow of aging streetlights. Will walked toward his car believing he was completely alone. Then he heard it. A faint sound drifted from the narrow space between 2 abandoned buildings. It wasn't loud, but something about it immediately felt wrong. It was the kind of sound that makes people instinctively look the other way, convincing themselves it isn't their problem. Will slowed his pace. Every lesson he'd learned growing up in the city told him to keep walking. It was late. The neighborhood was empty. Whatever had happened inside that alley could easily become someone else's concern, yet something made him stop. He turned and stepped into the darkness. There, leaning against a weathered brick wall, sat a teenage girl. She hugged her knees tightly against her chest, trembling beneath a winter coat far too large for her. A paper grocery bag had burst open beside her, scattering canned food, bread, and fruit across the rain-soaked pavement. One orange slowly rolled toward the storm drain. A fresh cut above her eyebrow stained the side of her face with blood. She looked exhausted, frightened, and barely able to stay conscious. When she noticed Will standing there, she whispered only a few words. "Please, don't walk past me." Without hesitation, Will knelt beside her. Her name was Diane. Between shaky breaths, she explained what had happened. She had just finished her after-school shift at a nearby pharmacy and was walking home when 2 men approached from behind. They grabbed at her belongings, and when she resisted, they shoved her violently into the brick wall before fleeing into the night. Ironically, they hadn't even stolen anything valuable. She had almost nothing with her. Dazed from striking her head, Diane had crawled into the alley and waited. Nearly 20 minutes had passed. Dozens of pedestrians had walked by, without noticing her, perhaps without wanting to notice. Will was the first person who stopped. He immediately removed his jacket and pressed part of the sleeve against the wound above her eye to slow the bleeding. He kept talking to her in a calm voice, asking simple questions and encouraging her to stay awake. The conversation itself wasn't important. His goal was simply to keep her focused. A car eventually rolled slowly past the entrance to the alley. Will jumped to his feet and waved both arms until the driver stopped. Because there were no cell phones then, he asked the driver to use a nearby pay phone to call emergency services. He refused to leave Diane alone even for a minute. Instead, he returned to her side and waited. 7 long minutes later, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the streets. Paramedics quickly surrounded Diane, checking her injuries, asking questions, and carefully stabilizing her before lifting her onto a stretcher. As they worked, Will quietly stepped back, watching with relief as they confirmed that her condition, while serious, was not life-threatening. One of the paramedics glanced toward him. "Are you family?" he asked. Will shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "I just heard her." The medic paused for a moment, giving him a look of quiet respect before returning to his patient. As the ambulance doors prepared to close, Diane turned toward Will. Their eyes met one final time. She tried to say something, but the words were swallowed by the noise of the engine as the doors shut. Will never heard what she said. He stood there until the flashing red lights disappeared around the corner. Then he walked back to his car, drove home, and never spoke publicly about that night. It became one small act of kindness buried beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, a moment he believed had ended forever, never imagining it would return decades later in front of millions of viewers. Will never shared the story, not because it lacked meaning, but because, to him, it never felt extraordinary. In his mind, nothing remarkable had happened. He had heard someone in trouble, stopped to help, and stayed until the ambulance arrived. That was it. To the young man he was then, it simply seemed like the right thing to do. At just 20 years old, he hadn't yet realized that many people would have kept walking. He didn't understand that what felt ordinary to him would one day be seen as an act of uncommon compassion. Life moved quickly after that. Only months later, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air introduced him to millions of viewers. Television success opened the door to blockbuster films, worldwide fame, and a career that never seemed to slow down. As the years passed, that October night became buried beneath premieres, interviews, award shows, and endless responsibilities. The memory never completely disappeared. It simply settled into a quiet corner of his life. We'll assume the young girl had recovered, built a future, and never thought about that night again. He hoped she was happy, and eventually he stopped wondering. Not because he didn't care, but because life has a way of covering even our most meaningful memories with newer ones. In more than 3 decades of interviews, he never mentioned the incident. He never told close friends, never discussed it publicly, and rarely even reflected on it himself. Some experiences remain deeply personal not because they're secret, but because putting them into words somehow makes them feel smaller than they truly were. For Diane Mercer, however, forgetting was never an option. She had been just 16 years old when fear and pain left her sitting alone in that dark alley. She still remembered the cold concrete beneath her, the sting of blood running down her face, and the overwhelming feeling that no one was coming. Then a stranger stopped. He knelt beside her without hesitation, wrapped his jacket around her wand, spoke to her calmly, and refused to leave until help arrived. Moments like that become part of a person's identity. They divide life into 2 chapters, before someone chose to help and after. Diane recovered completely. The cut above her eyebrow healed. She finished school, remained in Philadelphia, eventually married, and became a middle school English teacher. Every weekday she stood before classrooms full of 7th grade students, encouraging them to read, write, and believe in themselves. She built a family, raised 2 children, and created the kind of quiet, meaningful life many people hope for. By every measure, she was doing well. Yet there was one thing she had carried with her through every stage of adulthood. She wanted the young man who had saved her to know that she had survived. Nearly 10 years after that night, she happened to walk past a movie theater in Center City, Philadelphia. A large poster displayed the face of a rising Hollywood star. She stopped in her tracks. It was him. The young stranger from the alley had become Will Smith. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, staring at the poster as memories she hadn't revisited in years rushed back all at once. When she returned home, she wrote him a letter. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. She carefully explained who she was, reminded him of that October evening, thanked him for staying with her, and simply hoped the letter might reach him. It never did. The following year she tried again. Still nothing. She contacted his talent agency, searched for public mailing addresses, and even reached out through fan correspondence. One assistant apologized, explaining there was no direct way to forward personal messages. A journalist she met through a mutual acquaintance came close to delivering the story, but somehow the message disappeared before reaching Will himself. Each attempt ended the same way. The barriers surrounding celebrities proved almost impossible for ordinary people to cross. Eventually Diane accepted that she might never have the opportunity to thank him in person. She convinced herself that perhaps gratitude didn't always need to be spoken aloud. Maybe simply knowing what he had done was enough. Then, one evening, everything changed. Her son sat across from her at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He had recently watched an interview with Keanu Reeves. During the conversation, Keanu spoke warmly about Will Smith in a way that suggested they shared more than casual professional respect. They sounded like genuine friends. For the first time in years, Diane saw a possible path. Her son had already drafted another letter. This one wasn't addressed to Will. It was addressed to Keanu Reeves. All he needed was her permission to send it. The letter eventually reached Keanu through one of the charitable outreach channels monitored by his team. Most messages that arrived there were heartfelt but routine. This one was different. Keanu stood reading it from beginning to end without interruption. When he finished, he quietly sat down and read every word again. There was nothing exaggerated about it. No sensational claims. No requests for money or publicity. It simply told the story of a frightened 16-year-old girl, a lonely Philadelphia alley, and a young man in 1989 who had stopped when everyone else had kept walking. The letter described every detail with quiet honesty. It spoke about the jacket pressed gently against Diane's forehead to slow the bleeding. It remembered the calm voice that kept her awake until the ambulance arrived. It recounted the 35 years she had spent writing letters to production companies, talent agencies, and public offices, letters that disappeared into silence without ever reaching the man they were meant for. It even mentioned a moment from 1999. Standing on a busy Philadelphia sidewalk, Diane had stopped in front of a movie theater after recognizing the face on a poster. It was the young stranger from the alley, now one of Hollywood's biggest stars. She had stared at the image for several minutes, overwhelmed by the realization that the man who had once saved her life had become famous before she ever learned his name. The letter ended with a single sentence that lingered in Keanu's mind long after he finished reading. She doesn't want anything from him. She only wants him to know she survived. Keanu slowly lowered the pages onto his kitchen table. For several minutes he remained perfectly still. He had known Will Smith for years, not simply as an actor or public figure, but as the person behind the headlines. He knew the man who quietly helped others without seeking recognition, the friend who remembered birthdays, returned phone calls, and showed up when he promised he would. Keanu also understood something else. He knew what it meant to carry grief without speaking about it. He understood how life-changing moments often unfold away from cameras and applause. Sometimes the most important acts of kindness are the ones that never receive attention, leaving the person who offered them wondering if they ever truly mattered. He reached for his phone, but he didn't call Will. Not yet. Instead, he dialed Diane. Their conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. She spoke with remarkable calmness, never sounding resentful or bitter despite everything she had experienced. She told Keanu about the attack, the years spent searching for a way to reach Will, the countless letters that went unanswered, and the journalist who had almost succeeded in delivering her message. She also spoke about her life after that night, about teaching English to middle school students, about raising her children, about birthdays, graduations, family dinners, and all the ordinary moments that became possible because someone had stopped to help her decades earlier. Most importantly, she made one thing absolutely clear. She wasn't seeking publicity. She wasn't looking for money. She wasn't angry. She simply wanted the man who had saved her life to know that his decision to stop in that alley had mattered. When the conversation ended, Keanu sat quietly for several moments, reflecting on everything he had heard. Finally, he smiled gently. "I have an idea," he said. "It will have to happen in public. It will need witnesses, and you'll have to trust me completely." Before he could finish explaining, Diane answered, "Yes." Whatever Keanu had planned eventually changed the entire direction of that evening's television broadcast. The interview never returned to its original schedule. Instead, after reading the letter, Will slowly rose from his chair. Without speaking, he stepped off the stage and walked down the aisle between the audience seats. Every person in the studio watched him. He didn't stop until he reached the fourth row. There, a woman wearing a simple gray blazer quietly stood to meet him. It was Diane. She waited with the peaceful patience of someone who had carried gratitude for 35 years without expecting anything in return. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed far too small for what had brought them together again. Finally, Will broke the silence. "I never stopped thinking about you." Diane smiled softly. "I know," she replied. "I always believed you didn't." Will looked down at the photograph Diane's son had enclosed with the letter. The faded image had been taken outside the ambulance that night decades earlier. It showed a young man in a torn jacket standing beneath dim Philadelphia streetlights, watching emergency workers care for a frightened teenage girl. He stared at the picture for several seconds. Then emotion overcame him, and he found himself unable to speak. Around them, the audience remained standing. No applause interrupted the moment. No one reached for their phones. 300 strangers simply watched two lives reconnect in a room designed for entertainment but suddenly transformed into something far more meaningful. Keanu stayed quietly near the edge of the stage. He didn't step forward or attempt to become part of the reunion. This wasn't his story. His role had simply been to carry one unfinished chapter across decades and place it gently into the hands of the people who needed it most. In the days that followed, Will frame the old photograph. Rather than displaying it in an office or a public room where visitors might admire it, he placed it in the hallway of his home, the hallway he walked through every day. It served as a quiet reminder of the young man he had once been. A reminder that the smallest choices often leave the deepest marks on another person's life. Because genuine kindness rarely asks for recognition. It doesn't expect applause. And sometimes, even after many years have passed, it has a remarkable way of finding its way back home.